What's up, guys? Welcome back to Read and React. My name is Logan Campbell, and today we're going to be going over the 5 riskiest wide receivers that you need to know before your drafts. So I went over risk in a broad sense in the running back video. If you haven't seen that one, check it out. I do the same thing but for running backs. But just to give it some context here, risk is natural for every player. Every player in fantasy has some sort of risk, but not all of them carry the same amount or the same type of risk. And that's where you kind of see that differentiation from player to player. But risk is not inherently a bad thing. Risk is, in the end, what opens up value in your drafts, whether it's an injury causing a player to be taken later than he should be, or the fear that a player is going to lose the starting role. There is tons of ways to find value through that risk, and that's, in the end, what you're trying to do. So if you take no risks, you end up with a very boring, low upside, middle of the pack team. You end up with a team that goes 500, you get 5th, and you still didn't win. You're in a no different spot than the 10th place team because you didn't win, you didn't make the playoffs because you took no risks. You went average and you got average, and so if you don't take risks, you can't expect the upside to pay off. With that, though, you want to make sure that you're not taking all risks. If you go through the first 4 rounds of your draft and all 4 guys are essentially a make or break, boom or bust Christian McCaffrey type, okay, well, you can lose 2 or 3 of those guys and your season's over before it even started. You want to settle somewhere in the middle so that the risks give you the league-winning upside but aren't detrimental to your team, so that if the worst-case scenario does happen and that risk does come to fruition, you can still come back and still make some moves to compete. Because the season is a marathon, not a sprint. No matter what happens, there's always a chance to win, always a chance to make the playoffs, and you can't do that, though, if you lose every player because of a risk, and if you're stuck with a bunch of horrible guys, waiver wire pickups, and you can't make moves. So again, the main thing is go somewhere in the middle, take a couple risks here and there, but most of all, make sure they're calculated. Make sure you have done the research and you understand what you're getting yourself into, not just so that you can find the guys whose risks will pay off more, but also so that way you can be aware of their risks and help mitigate them in the event that something bad does happen. So what type of risk do we find at wide receiver? It's pretty similar to running back, but there is some minor nuance to a couple of them, so let's get into it. So first off is the high injury risk. Again, similar to running backs, injuries are killer. It's one of the main things that we try to predict in fantasy and do so extremely unsuccessfully. If you could know who is going to be healthy at the beginning of the year, you would honestly probably win your league every year because you would know exactly who to draft. Because honestly, injuries can be one of the biggest things that derail your season. And there is some luck to that, but it's also important to be aware of the guys coming in with more injury risk from the start. Whether that's a guy who has had a bunch of different injuries over time and has kind of had lingering issues where it's the same thing year after year, or if it's a guy coming off a serious injury like an ACL or an Achilles where we have the historical data that shows that their performance is hindered, it can take them a long time to ramp up. You need to be aware of that from both sides and not just say, oh, well, he's healthy. He's not starting on the PUP list or he's not starting on the IR. We see guys coming off these injuries all the time. It take half the year or even a full year just to get back to where they were. So definitely be aware of that because injuries, if you're not informed, can be detrimental when your guy underperforms all year due to that injury. So the other one that's more wide receiver specific is poor quarterback situation. And this is a little bit different than offensive ecosystem. It's a lot harder for a running back to overcome a bad offense because of the lack of touchdown equity. It's one of the biggest things running backs need. And on top of that, they don't catch that many passes typically, so you need that receiving upside to overcome it. Receivers, all they do is catch passes, and we see year over year plenty of guys have great years without tons of touchdowns. Plus, you can have bad offenses that don't score a lot where the quarterback is still helping produce quality receiving targets due to a high completion percentage, high amount of targets, high yardage, whatever it is. You can have those quarterbacks producing them even in a bad offense. Look at Arizona last year. They were able to produce Trey McBride, and Michael Wilson had some good weeks towards the end. Marvin Harrison Jr. even had a few weeks that it looked like he was back. So overall, the quarterback matters a lot more than the offensive ecosystem. Like if you look at Justin Jefferson, whose quarterback was horrible and it totally tanked his year. you need a decent quarterback, or at the very least a quarterback who can get the ball to your guy, because if he can't catch the ball, he's not going to score points. So the last one, which does kind of fit in with the running backs, but again, some nuance to it, is the projection of growth. This is when a player hasn't put up the numbers that they're projected to hit, and it can be a risk if they don't reach that new level that we're projecting them. This, again, is mainly true for young players, rookies, or guys who get a new quarterback, and it's just important to acknowledge and be aware of that possible floor and not just draft for the potential. Again, you need to know, okay, if this doesn't go well, if he's not having good chemistry with the quarterback, or the quarterback isn't an improvement, or the receiver doesn't take a step forward, you need to be aware that it could be more of the same from the previous year. And if he's being drafted, 8 to 12 spots ahead of where he was the previous year, well, then you just cost yourself about 2 or 3 rounds of value. So it's just being aware of it. It's just making sure that you have really thought through what moves are really going to make a difference, what guys are really going to step up and break out, versus the guys that may be fool's gold that everyone else is thinking that will take a step forward, while in reality, they're just going to be more of the same. So risk alone does not make a player one to avoid. We see all the time receivers with risk factors perform well, and honestly, that's where you find the league winners. And it's really just doing your own evaluation and making sure you are aware of the different types of risk and the risk that the players carry. And again, hedging your bets, making sure that your team isn't one injury or one lost roll away from a season over and wasting the entire year. You want to make sure that you build your team with some redundancy, so that if one of those bad things does happen, you can come back, you can make a trade, you can go get a guy off waivers, you have some depth that can help you still win your league. So all the receivers that I'm going to go over are top 50 picks. This was done intentionally because these guys would start on pretty much any team from any draft. And I think that when you're really looking at the risks that you want to make sure that you are aware of, it's with your starters. The later you get into a draft, the less the risks start to really hit, because if you're drafting your 4th bench spot, if he gets hurt or if something happens, you just drop him and replace him with a waiver wire guy. So overall, I think we're going to really focus on the starters here, because that's where your season can really take a turn if something bad happens, especially early on. So the first guy we're going to talk about is Justin Jefferson. He currently goes off the board at wide receiver 6, 11.8 overall, and this is honestly the latest I think we've seen Justin Jefferson since he was a rookie. I'm pretty sure he's been literally a top 3 receiver, top 5 pick pretty much every year since he first burst onto the scene, but that was also because he was seen as quarterback agnostic, where you never had to worry about who was throwing him the ball. Well, J.J. McCarthy did what no one else could do, for better or worse. He made Justin Jefferson a mid-at-best fantasy wide receiver. He finished, I believe, around wide receiver 20 last year, and the worst he had finished before that was wide receiver 6, which is where he's currently being drafted. It does seem like Kyler Murray will be the starter this year, which does make me feel a lot better. He's produced some high-quality fantasy seasons from receivers, and again, Justin Jefferson is too good of a receiver to have this happen for the 2nd year in a row, and if Minnesota can't figure their stuff out, I think Jefferson is going to want out, request a trade, go somewhere else, because you can't keep getting stuck with such bad quarterback play year after year. He's the cheapest he's ever been, and where you can get him now is right at the end of the 1st or beginning of the 2nd, and I really do think this is a risk worth taking. I think as long as Kyler Murray is the starter, it at least gives Justin Jefferson a much higher floor than he had last year, to where you can pretty reliably assume he'll be a wide receiver 1 and hopefully get back to his former self. I like him as a target, especially near the turn. If you compare him with a guy like James Cook or Amon-Ra St. Brown, one of the more stable options comparatively, I think he's a really, really good pick, because as long as he's not your first guy, your anchor pick, he can have a slight down year and you're not completely screwed. Justin Jefferson has had as consistent of a fantasy run out as anyone up until last year, and I really hope he can get back to that, because fantasy is better when he is elite. So the next guy we are going to be talking about is probably the guy projected to take the biggest year 2 leap I've ever seen. I mean, I've never seen someone do less in their rookie year and be projected for more production later. And I'm talking about Luther Burden, wide receiver 21, 48.8 overall in ADP. And honestly, I get the hype. He had a really good year in terms of his efficiency metrics. When he was on the field, he looked great. But with that, he wasn't on the field enough to where we got a consistent sample size. He only had over 60% of a snap share once. In one game, he had over 60% of snaps, and he was under 50% in the majority of games. He had pretty much zero proven production besides some random one-off games, and he was a high draft pick. I will say that. He went in, I believe, the second round to Ben Johnson. It was one of the guys Ben Johnson went and got in his first year coaching. But still, I mean, we're looking at a guy who went from a wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5, who's now being projected as a low-end wide receiver 2 or a elite flex option. And while I do think it's possible, I think there's a lot more risk here than people want to think. DJ Moore is gone. This will allow the targets to become more consolidated and hopefully allow Luther Burden to get on the field more. But it's still going to fall to Burden, Rome, and Colston Loveland. And more than likely, one of Burden or Rome Odunze will be left out. I would be shocked if both receivers popped off and Colston Loveland was the odd man out in this receiving room. So Burden does have kind of a discount here as the projected wide receiver 1 of the Bears. If you could say he was going to get the Amon-Ra St. Brown role, then he would definitely be more in the wide receiver 16 to wide receiver 14 range. But we just have no proof of what he can do. He has the talent, he has the advanced metrics, but those aren't what are going to score you points and win you your weeks. He was up there in terms of the advanced metrics with Puka in a per route basis, but again, he was only playing 60% of snaps on a good day, on his best day for that matter. It's really hard for me to spend a 5th rounder on a guy who is hardly even on the field, and while he does have the potential, I think his downside is just so much larger than people realize. I think if things go bad for Luther Burden, it's not going to be a wide receiver 3 borderline flex play in a pinch type of thing. It's going to be he's an unplayable flex option who just rots on your bench, gives you one good week that makes you upset, and then the rest of the weeks he's getting 3 catches for 30 yards. So I like Burden. I don't really like Odunze. Honestly, this whole Bears receiving room outside of Loveland is just kind of a mess. And I think the other thing people are forgetting is that this does rely on Caleb Williams taking a step forward. He threw for under 4,000 yards last year and under 30 touchdowns and was crazy inaccurate. And so in a PPR format, he needs to be giving them those easy receptions, those dump offs, and that's where Luther Burden can really thrive. But if he's not going to be able to get enough of that production, he's not going to take that step forward, especially when we haven't really seen him prove where he can find those points elsewhere. So overall, I don't hate Luther Burden as a pick. I think he's a little overinflated right now, and if I'm being honest, I think it's only going to get worse. But if you can get him as your flex option, I don't hate that, but he still is just a really scary pick. But like I said, you do have to take some risks to win your league. You can't expect to play it safe, and he might be one of those guys this year that you have to just take and hope, and maybe he'll be a league winner. Maybe he will completely screw you over. I'm not the one to say. That's on you to figure out, and if you like him, draft him. So the next guy we're going to talk about, he had a really good year last year, breakout year. He produced very well, and he should have similar production this year, but there's just something about the principle of drafting him that freaks me out, and I'm talking about George Pickens. Now, George Pickens as a player, I love. I think he is fun to watch. He's electric. He is constantly making highlight reels. He's good at every level of the field. But where I'm having a hard time is taking a wide receiver 2 at wide receiver 9, 23.6 overall, as potentially my first receiver off the board. Like I said, he is talented, but he is still behind CeeDee Lamb, and even as good as the Cowboys' passing offense is, I just cannot justify taking the second option as a top 10 positional player. It just doesn't make sense. He finished wide receiver 5 last year, which is why his price is being jacked up, but that was largely due to CeeDee getting hurt. When CeeDee was hurt, he averaged 2 points per game more than he did the rest of the year on the back of his 2 highest performances of the year, which were 2 30-plus point games. Now, I do love that he has that potential, and again, I do think he'll have a pretty good year. I would say he's a pretty solid top 14, 15 receiver, but I just don't think he has the consistent top 5 upside because, again, without that injury, he would have been more in that wide receiver 10 range where he's being drafted now, and I still just don't like taking the second option as my first receiver. If you can get him as your second receiver with a running back, I think that's the ideal scenario, but you do need some help from your league getting him to fall there. And currently he's going before Nico Collins and Chris Olave, who I both like more. I feel they both have way more upside. They're the primary receivers on their teams, and they both have true top 5 upside without needing an injury. And again, that's kind of my main problem with George Pickens, is for a top 10 positional player, you're usually hoping they have at least top 5, if not top 3 upside, which he just doesn't have unless CD gets hurt or by some miracle he takes the dominant role, which I just don't see happening. I don't hate the player. I don't hate what you're even going to get from him this year. Again, I do think he'll be somewhere around his ADP, but he, to me, is one of those kind of average players that isn't going to win you your league because of his lack of upside. I don't see how he has much more room to improve in terms of his performance. Again, without some help from things that he can't control, which is not what we like to bet on. I think until you get down to some of the more true floor plays like Devontae Smith and Zay Flowers, I think that's where you start to have a really good case for taking him more because of his proven production and just the elite Cowboys passing offense. But I just really cannot justify taking him as my first receiver, a top 10 receiver off the board, when he isn't even the first receiver on his own team. The next guy fits into the category of injury, which is so devastating because a guy coming off an injury, the reason you don't like him or he has risk or you're worried about taking him has nothing to do with him as a player. We really start to sympathize with these guys over time because you really like the way they play, you like the things they do for your team, but coming off serious injuries, they are just not viable fantasy options, at least early in the year. So I'm talking about Malik Nabers, who's coming off an ACL injury that he suffered early last year. It has been a while, so hopefully there's been enough time that he can get back sooner than expected. But still, coming off an ACL injury, it's just really, really hard to predict when he's going to start to be back to normal and when he's going to produce to normal, most of all. He's going off the board at wide receiver 14, 30.2 overall, so right about the 3-4 turn. So again, you're looking at possibly your wide receiver 2 not producing until halfway through the year. Can you really afford to have him either sit on the bench or just have really, really bad weeks from time to time up until halfway through the year? Because I think once you get into the later weeks, he's going to become a league winner because we've seen the talent this guy has. He was wide receiver 6 in 2024. We haven't seen him play with Jackson Dart yet, so that is another slight risk, but I'm not too worried about that. Jackson Dart looked phenomenal last year, but there has been a lot of positivity around him in camp in terms of his coming back from the injury. I don't trust it. We see this year over year where guys are saying, oh, he looks great, his recovery is coming along super well, only for them to still be off and on the first 6 to 8 weeks of the season. So take the coach speak with a grain of salt until you are truly seeing him play in pads and see how he moves. That's kind of the first indication that he's back to form. You really want to see him playing game speed and taking that contact. Right now, I believe the estimates are around 4 to 8 weeks of him getting back to full strength. And so it's really just a matter of if you can afford to keep him, again, on the bench, maybe in your flex spot if you're desperate, because there's going to be some rough weeks in there. Guys with ACL injuries, they are slower, they can't cut as well, and they just aren't used to the game yet. And by the end of the season, again, I do think he'll be an elite option, but it's really going to take time. He is a guy that I think will be a great buy low once he is starting to come back more, but obviously you cannot bank on trading for a player because if any of your league mates are employing the same strategy, then you're just cooked. So I think where he goes right now is still a little bit high. Again, he's going above guys like Devontae Smith and Zay Flowers, some of the higher floor guys that do have some of that upside, but I do think he's worth a shot if he can fall a little bit. If you're able to get him in your flex spot and then draft an extra flex like a Parker Washington or one of those guys kind of around the wide receiver 30 to 35 range to fill in until he's back, I don't think that's a bad strategy because, again, at some point this year, he's going to be a valuable fantasy asset. You just need to make sure that you're still in a place to compete when he is back to that production because otherwise you could have lost your first 5 weeks and now you're out of the playoffs by the time he comes back. You need to just make sure that you can stay the course until he comes back because he is truthfully one of the biggest risks in fantasy this year, but also one of the ones that has the most potential to pay off. So the last guy we're going to talk about is someone who I don't really know what to call his risk because he himself is the risk. He is quite literally a risk to himself, which is a very unique situation to be in, I gotta be honest. I don't remember the last time we had a player like this since maybe Antonio Brown. And no, Brandon Ayuk doesn't count. I'm done with that whole situation, whatever. But I'm talking about Rashee Rice, the guy who is rehabbing his knee in prison this year for violating his parole or whatever it was. And to be frank, he's just an absolute bonehead off the field. I don't know if he's just got some bad influences in his life or if he just genuinely doesn't think before he does anything, but it seems like he's always in the news for the wrong reasons, and that is one of the scariest things when drafting a guy in fantasy, because you can deal with stuff that happens on the field. An injury is a freak thing that you can, sometimes see coming, but most of the time is unforeseen. Or his job gets taken because he gets beaten out by a better guy. Whatever, that's just the way the game goes. But Rashee Rice just goes and does what he plays life like it's Grand Theft Auto. I mean, he's essentially Antonio Brown without the 4 to 5 years of elite normal production. Now, Rashee Rice has had moments where he has flashed and been really, really solid in fantasy. I mean, he averaged almost 19 points per game last year when he was finally back from his suspension, but he's only played one complete season due to those suspensions and multiple injuries. And if he had just had like some injury history, whatever, that I could live with. But the off the field stuff that's fully in his control is what really worries me, because if you draft this guy, every week for the entire season, you're going to be worried about seeing a news headline with his name on it because it could genuinely come at any time, and then you're left scrambling. He currently goes off the board at wide receiver 10, 24.4 overall, and I just do not like taking him there. If there's a chance that he is your first receiver on your team, and that is kind of not a situation I want to be in at all. Because again, all of a sudden you lose your wide receiver 1 because he went and robbed a bank or did something stupid to a strip club in Miami. Like, genuinely, who knows? I'm telling you, this guy lives life like it's Grand Theft Auto. And so I don't hate him as a pick if you can get him in the 3rd, as long as you have another wide receiver, because you do need a backup plan to him. And you better be well aware of what you're getting yourself into, because Rashee Rice just might be the most begrudging pick of the year. I don't know that there's a single person who's going to go, man, I'm so excited to draft Rashee Rice right now, clicking that button. I feel like it is cover your eyes and just pray that he doesn't do something. And he does have top 5 potential. I will say, to the guy's credit, he is a very good player, but he is also just one of the scariest picks because he could just completely go off the face of the earth, and there's not much that you could do about it or that you could even predict. So that does it for riskiest wide receivers for the 2026 fantasy football season. Just to recap, we went over Justin Jefferson, Luther Burden, George Pickens, Malik Nabers, and Rashee Rice as some of the riskiest wide receivers in this year's draft, especially some of those guys who are going a bit earlier. And again, I'm not here to tell you who to draft. I'm not here to tell you who to not draft. What I'm here to do is present you with information so that you can make the right decisions on draft day and feel good about the team that you're picking. So with that, we'll be getting into the quarterback and tight end later this week on Friday, so be sure to check into that video. And as always, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.